I'm Nima Rajan. Justin Trudeau spoke to Dutch parliamentarians in The Hague today. He told them disinformation campaigns and extremism are a serious threat to global economies and democracy. Paying homage to the friendship between Canada and the Netherlands that rose out of the Second World War, the Prime Minister said that the very values and security that Allied forces fought to defend are in peril. He didn't name names, but some Dutch parliamentarians centered on the rising influence of China. This is a fact that Mr. Trudeau said poses tremendous challenges around the world to democracies and our trading systems. Well, meanwhile, Canada's Red Chamber has adopted a new rule. Senators will have to be fully vaccinated against COVID-19 if they want to participate in Senate proceedings in person. Speaker George Furey made the announcement after consultations with the leaders of the various groups in the upper house. Well, today is the deadline for workers in the core federal public service to declare their COVID-19 vaccination status or face unpaid leave. However, Chris Aylward, the president of the Public Service Alliance of Canada, says there is a big hole in the policy. He says it's on whether unvaccinated people should be accommodated under the Canadian Human Rights Act. Previously, the Prime Minister said exemptions will be difficult to obtain and simply having a personal conviction that vaccines are bad will not be sufficient. Critics of a major drug price overhaul hope a fresh federal cabinet will put a temporary stop to new regulations set to take effect in January. The Patented Medicine Prices Review Board is set to change the way it sets up a price cap on medicines in Canada. This in an effort to lower excessively high drug costs. The overhaul has drawn the disapproval of patient groups and drug manufacturers. This as well as some pharmacists, doctors, academics, and even provincial governments. Some critics fear that a drastic drop in the sticker price of medicines will make Canada an unattractive place to launch new products. This could leave life-saving new therapies out of reach for Canadians. British Columbia's premier has a growth in his throat and will be undergoing a biopsy today. John Horgans says he's been in and out of the hospital for a number of weeks for tests after noticing a lump in his neck. He expects an overnight stay after undergoing the procedure. The premier says he intends to keep working and has no plans to step down. He will also continue in the position as the head of the Council of the Federation. The Alberta government has introduced legislation to help municipalities with property taxes. The plan would help recoup some of the millions of dollars in unpaid property taxes that they're owed by energy companies. Municipal Affairs Minister Rick McIver says it's a legal resource where the municipalities can actually seize accessible assets that exist within that municipality. The legislation is a response to a growing problem of oil and gas companies, both solvent and insolvent, not paying municipal property taxes. Rural Municipalities Alberta says those unpaid taxes total around $245 million, about half of which is owed from companies still operating. A backlog of court cases in Ontario is prompting the government to turn to a big budget solution. Some $72 million is being tapped to help tackle the issue. Part of the funding is going toward hiring more than 340 new court employees. Attorney General Doug Downey says that includes Crown prosecutors, victim support staff, and bail vetters. Those are experienced Crown attorneys who facilitate faster bail decisions and resolutions when appropriate. The COVID-19 pandemic has stalled tens of thousands of cases. A funeral for a 58-year-old firefighter who died during a recent water rescue is set to be held today in Old Montreal. Pierre Lacroix of the Montreal Fire Department drowned on October 17th. This after the rescue boat he was in capsized and he became trapped underneath. The official funeral for the water rescue specialist, a veteran of more than 30 years, will take place at noon at the Notre Dame Basilica. Thousands of public sector workers in New Brunswick went on strike this morning to back demands for better pay. The list includes school bus drivers, custodians, some healthcare workers, and educational support workers. The Canadian Union of Public Employees says the provincial government abruptly walked away from contract talks on Tuesday night. Premier Blaine Higgs has said he is prepared to introduce back-to-work legislation. A plan to create North America's first wild refuge for marine park whales is taking a step forward today in Nova Scotia. The U.S.-based Whale Sanctuary Project plans to officially open its Visitor and Operations Center in Sherbrooke on the province's eastern shore. Executive Director Charles Vinnick says the new center has been built in a renovated home on the main street. The goal is to build a 40-hectare coastal refuge south of Port Hilford, which is a 20-minute drive southeast of Sherbrooke. All right, stay tuned. We'll be back after the break with an interview with the David Suzuki Foundation. Stay tuned. The Liberal climate plan could meet Canada's greenhouse gas emissions targets for the first time before the end of this decade. That's the finding of a study by Clean Prosperity. It comes ahead of a climate talk at the G20 summit and the United Nations COP26 meeting. The recent study by Clean Prosperity says all of Mr. Trudeau's recent climate policies could get Canada emissions to 41% below what they were in 2005 by 2030. That would be just within reach of the new 40 to 45% target he set last spring. But are these goals realistic? And what can we expect from Canada's presence at these two major global summits? Well, joining us now to talk more on this is Ms. Lisa Gue, the National Policy Manager at the David Suzuki Foundation. Ma'am, welcome back to Forum Daily.
Nice to be here again. Thank you.
So let's start with the COP26 summit, ma'am. What is expected to be discussed at this meeting?
Cop26 is the international gathering of global leaders to discuss their moving forward with their commitments to tackle climate change. It is the 26th time the globe has gathered, and the latest science is increasingly even more compelling about the dire state of climate change. It's literally, the scientists working on these assessments are calling it a code red for humanity. We're running out of time to turn things around. So it's critical that our global leaders get it right this time.
And what do we know so far about Canada's current initiatives to tackle climate change and cut emissions?
Well, unfortunately, Canada's emissions continue to increase when they should be declining. Now, a glimmer of hope, their emissions are increasing less quickly than they used to. And the government has announced a number of new initiatives that could really be critical to turn things around, but only if they're implemented in short order.
And at the same time, we know Canada has been criticized for making promises around climate change and not following through. So have we ever hit any of our climate targets before, Ms. Gue?
Unfortunately, we don't have a great track record. Many people will remember the Kyoto Protocol that was ratified by Canada in 2002. And under that international agreement, Canada was supposed to decrease its greenhouse gas emissions by 6% from 1990 levels by 2012. And instead, our national emissions rose by 30% during that period. And ultimately, Canada withdrew from the Kyoto Protocol under the former government. And it hasn't, recent efforts also, again, have not been successful in actually bending this curve. However, there are some new measures that have been put in place that are starting to show results. Top among them is the newer national price on carbon. That is certainly a heavy hitter when it comes to reducing carbon emissions. During the recent election campaign, the Liberal Party, which of course formed government ultimately, also made some important promises that, if implemented quickly and in a strong fashion, could also be game changers. One of the important ones is a pledge to cap and ratchet down emissions from the oil and gas sector. This is Canada's largest and still growing source of emissions, and the government has also promised new regulatory measures to accelerate the shift to zero emission vehicles. Transportation accounts for nearly a quarter of our emissions. And the government has said that its new target is that all vehicles in Canada be zero emission vehicles by 2035. Currently, at latest count, they weren't even 4%. So we've got a ways to go, and it will require some mandatory measures, new policies, new targets, new policies, new regulations, and an investment to make these changes possible.
Some very bold initiatives there, ma'am. Another thing to consider is a previous meeting of G20 environment ministers actually arrived at an impasse around setting temperature limits and phasing out coal. So what can be expected of climate talks during the G20 meeting this upcoming weekend?
Yeah, interesting timing. The G20 countries are gathering just before many of those same leaders will be moving over to Cop26. And they are G20 is primarily an economic forum, but they are expected to the Italian hosts have put the planet, including climate change, on the agenda. So hopefully there will be some opportunity for the leaders to have some preliminary discussions and come to COP with strong commitments and action beyond the talk. You referenced previous failures to come to agreement around the coal phase out. We not only need to move beyond coal, we need to start talking about, we need to start acting, implementing a managed decline of fossil fuel production altogether.
The economy grew 0.4% in August before apparently flatlining in September. Statistics Canada reports the boost in August was thanks to a rise in activity in accommodation and food services. Retail trade and air travel, which were also hit hard by COVID-19, were helped by the recent easing of public health restrictions. But that was offset by the agriculture sector, which posted its second straight monthly decline. That represents the largest back-to-back monthly contractions since Statistics Canada began collecting comparable data in 1997. Graduates from nursing schools in Nova Scotia are being guaranteed jobs in the province over the next 5 years. This in order to help address chronic staffing shortages. Premier Tim Houston says nursing graduates from universities and colleges in Nova Scotia will have a standing offer to work in the province. Mr. Houston says the move is in response to recent criticism in media reports. They said that not enough is being done to recruit new nurses and to let them know that they are needed in the province. The Premier says the province certifies about 700 registered nurses and licensed practical nurses each year, and it needs to hire as many as possible to fill hundreds of vacancies. The National Advisory Committee on Immunization is now recommending booster shots of mRNA COVID-19 vaccines. This for people who received 2 doses of the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine. It is also recommending boosters for adults over the age of 70, frontline healthcare workers with a short interval between their first 2 doses, and First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. The committee says there is emerging evidence on vaccine effectiveness against asymptomatic infection and mild COVID-19 disease. It finds strength may decrease over time, and a booster could help restore protection. The Canadian Heritage Department says flags on federal buildings will remain at half-mast leading up to Remembrance Day. This instead of being raised and lowered again. That's unless Prime Minister Justin Trudeau decides differently. The flag has been flying at half-mast at federal buildings since late May. This in honor of the discovery of children's unmarked graves at former residential school sites. The issue is gaining renewed attention in light of Remembrance Day. This is when flags are typically lowered in honor of veterans and Canadian soldiers who died fighting for the country. A commercial fishing organization has won the right to intervene in a court challenge involving Indigenous fishing rights. In a decision released yesterday, Justice Kevin Cody of the Nova Scotia Supreme Court granted a request by the United Fisheries Conservation Alliance. Cape Breton's Potlotek First Nation says the province's fish buying regulations are a violation of the band's right to a moderate livelihood fishery. The band began its legal challenge against the regulations in April. Indigenous child welfare advocates say if the Trudeau government is serious about its commitment to reconciliation, it won't take back a case to court. The government has until later today to announce it will compensate First Nations children. These children were removed from their homes on reserves and endured abuse and suffering in provincial foster care systems. Or the government could choose to appeal a federal court ruling that upheld 2 historic decisions from the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal. Another decision involves making more First Nations children eligible for accessing government services. This despite jurisdictional disputes about payment. More onions sold in Ontario have now been recalled for possible salmonella contamination. The Canadian Food Inspection Agency has added Dorsey and MVP brand yellow onions, Pierre C brand yellow and white onions, and Riga Farms brand yellow onions to the recall. An initial recall was prompted by an investigation in the U.S. It involved red, white, and yellow raw onions from ProSource Produce LLC of Haley, Idaho. No illnesses have been linked to the product in Canada, but some people have reportedly been sickened south of the border. Merriam-Webster has added 455 new words to its dictionary, and this is including dad bod, am I right, and TBH, which is short for to be honest. Merriam-Webster defines dad bod as a physique regarded as typical of an average father, especially one that is slightly overweight and not extremely muscular. The pandemic also gave rise to a collection of new words going into the dictionary, including super spreader, long COVID, and vaccine passport. All right, we'll be back after the break with more news from around the world. G20 leaders will address climate change and the coronavirus during the summit this weekend, but China's president will not attend in person. Meanwhile, Japan holds parliamentary elections on Sunday, while Sudan's coup leader says he will appoint a prime minister soon. And we've got big news around the world as social media giant Facebook announced that it's changing its name to Meta. We'll have these stories and more news from around the world when we come back from the short break, so stay tuned, everybody. We'll be right back. The global economy is giving leaders of the group of 20 countries a lot to talk about at their summit this weekend in Rome. The presidents and prime ministers, representing 80% of the global economy, will confront a recovery hampered by an energy crunch. It is said to be spurring higher fuel and utility prices, new COVID-19 outbreaks, and logjams in supply chains. However, one thing is certain: leaders will be signing off on a deal to enact a global minimum corporate tax. Chinese President Xi Jinping will take part in the UN Climate Summit in Glasgow, Scotland by video link. China, the biggest source of carbon dioxide and other climate-changing industrial gases, has pledged to reach peak emissions of CO2 before 2030. The country also says it will achieve carbon neutrality by using forests and other measures to absorb as much carbon as it emits by 2060. Japan's new Prime Minister Fumio Kishida faces a crucial test in Sunday's national parliamentary elections. The election result will determine if his government will have enough support to stay in power long enough to repair the pandemic-hit economy and tackle climate change and address China's rise. Mr. Kishida dissolved the lower house 10 days after taking office and called for this vote, saying he wanted a mandate from voters. His party is likely to lose some seats but maintain the majority. His grip on power will depend on just how many allies he loses. The island nation of Tonga has reported its first ever case of COVID-19 after a traveler from New Zealand tested positive. Tonga is among the few remaining nations in the world that have avoided outbreaks of the virus. Like many of its neighbors, Tonga's isolation has helped keep it safe. But it faces big challenges should the virus take hold due to an under-resourced health system. The traveler has been isolating at a quarantine hotel. The Prime Minister plans to make an announcement on Monday about any future lockdowns. Kenya's President Uhuru Kenyatta says Africa is at a crossroads. He told the UN Security Council on Thursday that the continent is poised to reap the economic benefits of its youthful population and economic reforms. But on the other hand, he added Africa is facing the spread of terrorism and insurgency. Ghana's President Nana Akufo-Addo pointed to multiple threats to the territorial integrity of some African countries. Many civilians facing serious threats and instability in some nations. This is further complicated by the interests of different actors, not only within conflict areas, but also from outside of the continent. The Sudanese general who seized power in a coup this week says the military he heads will appoint a technocrat prime minister to rule alongside it within a week. In an interview with Russia's state-owned Sputnik news agency, Abdel Fattah Burhan said the new premier will form a cabinet that will share leadership of the country with the armed forces. On Monday, Mr. Burhan dissolved the transitional government after a coup and detained Prime Minister Abdallah Hamdok, who was later released after pressure from the West. Wild winds in the city of Melbourne and across the Australian state of Victoria have left more than 450,000 homes without power. Energy manager AEMO says the damage was severe. It warned that some customers wouldn't have electricity over the weekend or even by early next week. In some places, gusts reached over 160 kilometers per hour. The storms came ahead of the first weekend that people in Victoria are able to move around freely since COVID-19 restrictions were lifted. The winds are expected to ease by Friday evening. Joel Quenneville is out as the coach of the Florida Panthers. He has resigned 2 days after he was among those implicated for not swiftly responding to allegations by Chicago Blackhawks player Kyle Beach. Mr. Beach alleges that he was sexually assaulted by then Blackhawks assistant coach Brad Aldrich during the 2010 Stanley Cup playoffs. In a statement released to TSN, Mr. Quenneville says he resigns with deep regret, expressing his sorrow for the pain Mr. Beach has suffered. He says he will educate himself on ensuring hockey spaces are safe for everyone. Facebook is changing, its name at least. The social networking giant now calls itself Meta Platforms Inc., or Meta for short. CEO Mark Zuckerberg says the new name reflects a commitment to developing the idea of people surrounding themselves with technology, a concept it calls the metaverse. As for the social network itself, it will still be Facebook. Skeptics claim that the change is an effort to steer attention away from the Facebook papers. A 90-year-old mechanic from Gloucestershire in the UK was honored on Wednesday to commemorate 75 years of working with the same company. Brian Webb started apprenticing at Vauxhall in 1946. When he turned 65, he agreed to stay on for a couple more years, but that eventually turned into another 25 years on the job. All right, I'm Nima Rajan, and this was Forum Daily News. Take care, Canada, and have a great weekend.